Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Katie Kingsbury. I oversee the opinion report at the New York Times, and today we are talking about the threat of nuclear weapons in the 21st century. The risk of nuclear conflict is rising. All of the nuclear nations are currently rebuilding their arsenals, and there's never been a more complicated and complex global politics than there is today. We have this distinguished panel to talk about the present dangers. Sir John Chipman at the end, Kim Budil in the center, and President Rinkēvičs from Latvia here next to me. I want to jump right in. We only have 30 minutes for this conversation and a lot of ground to cover. John, perhaps you can start us off by setting the stage. What is the reality of the nuclear threat in the 21st century, and where do those present dangers lie in the next arms race?
Well, the reality of the nuclear threat today comes, I think, from two different types of sources. The first is that there has not been effective arms control on Iran's nuclear program once the JCPOA, the arms control agreement made by the Obama administration, was lost in negotiation. There is a judgment now that Iran might only be a few weeks away from being able to develop a warhead. It would be quite some time before they could put it on a ballistic missile that would reach the United States, but nevertheless, they're a lot closer to a nuclear weapon now than they were the day the JCPOA were concluded. The DPRK, North Korea, has also probably increased its own nuclear warhead count up to perhaps 40 or 50. In the case of China, their warhead count perhaps increased from 200 to 600. So those additional actors are an important feature. And I think the second feature is that the greatest arms control measure for nuclear weapons proliferation during the Cold War was the US policies of extended deterrence, giving a nuclear guarantee, in effect, to its principally European and Asian allies. And that meant that countries like Japan, Korea, Sweden, others did not feel that they had to get nuclear weapons because they were covered by that umbrella. If there is a sense that that umbrella will fold, those countries will look again at their national nuclear policies.
Mr. President, maybe you can talk a little bit about what it's like living essentially so close to this question of a nuclear threat. I mean, I'm sure it's top of mind for you and your fellow citizens. Have the threats from Russia during the conflict changed any of your plans or preparations about nuclear use in Ukraine? Have the nuclear threats spurred any posture changes?
Well, actually, I would say that when Russia invaded Ukraine back in February 2022, and I think it was a week or so when we heard first threats about the use of nuclear weapons, tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, our position has been, I would say, to some extent realistic, even skeptical that Mr. Putin or his generals would actually deliver on this threat. We were taking all that kind of policy or statements with some grain of salt.
Sure, of course.
So having said that, definitely I wouldn't rule out use of tactical nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons, maybe even when it comes to some strategic operations, if Kremlin, if the Russian regime, Putin's regime, would feel really threatened in a way that they could lose power because of some very, I would say, a strong opposition to the war in Russia or losing a war in Ukraine in a way that would threaten the existence of the regime. So from that point of view, I would say that we have always been a bit critical of such kind of statements that we are hearing. At the same time, let's face it, you never know, because authoritarian regimes or totalitarian regimes are not fully rational, and also part of defense spending, part of increased awareness of the population, civil defense, crisis management is also directed into the way that we should be prepared for all kinds of eventualities. And yes, also we were reconsidering some of our policies when it comes also to chemical, biological, and also nuclear threats that they could arise.
I appreciate that you, as you put it, all of this needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But did you have any more concerns when Russia decided to deploy weapons into Belarus and the other Baltic states?
No.
No?
To the extent that we knew that even before Russia invaded Ukraine, not only back in 2022, but when Crimea was occupied in 2014, there have been nuclear weapons close to our borders. We have quite good information that also Kaliningrad Oblast, where Russians have a lot of military infrastructure, military units, had some nuclear weapons. So that was not something that I would say we would see that a kind of completely new threat.
Okay.
We saw this, of course, as escalatory movement, just sending message to those people in the West who wanted to, and they actually did, impose so-called self-imposed red lines, trying to avoid some escalation. So from that point of view, yes, we monitor what Russia does in Belarus, what Russia does close to our borders. We do know what is there, but to say that this really changed some kind of threat perception, the threat perception was already high before all those moves.
Okay. And Kim, you are the director of the Livermore National Laboratory in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about the U.S.'s nuclear complex is currently undergoing a major re-entrenchment. We, in New York Times Opinion, recently had a piece, the U.S. is spending about $1.7 trillion to rebuild its nuclear arsenal. Can you describe some of the changes that are underway at the lab and how you're thinking about what you need to do to recruit talent to essentially build these new weapons?
Yes, I'd be glad to. So as you said, this is an absolutely extraordinarily and complex endeavor that we've undertaken. The U.S. is in the process of recapitalizing and modernizing all three legs of the triad, both the delivery systems and the warheads, and at the same time rebuilding the infrastructure that's required to do that. So after several decades of not really building, we find ourselves with an atrophied enterprise. And so the need to do all of these things at one time is part of what drives the significant cost. Some of the facilities that are required are very complex. Any facility that handles any nuclear material, as an example, is extraordinarily complex undertaking. So at the laboratory, we're trying to do several things. One is to ensure that we can build a safe, secure, effective, and sustainable enterprise and deterrent. And so that means rather than trying to reconstitute capabilities from the Cold War, we're trying to build capabilities that take advantage of modern technology for manufacturing, as an example, that take advantage of the very significant science and technology infrastructure we've built over the prior 30 years of the Stockpile Stewardship Program to enable us to do things in smarter ways. So, we understand there are many lessons from the buildup of the nuclear enterprise during the Cold War. We don't want to revisit some of those choices and challenges. So that's one thing we're trying to do. We're also trying to meet the need of a rapidly changing security environment. And I think both of my colleagues here have well represented how complex and how quickly changing the world is today, just in a geopolitical context, but in a science and technology context, the same thing is happening with the advent of AI and other tools, large-scale supercomputing. We just cited the world's largest supercomputer. What is possible and how rapidly technology can evolve is changing on a daily basis.
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the risks that are involved with that new technology. Particularly, I know that there's a lot of conversation around AI in the military space.
Yes, and so I think we think about AI as an enabler, as an accelerant, and for people, as I keep referring to it as an exoskeleton. It doesn't replace people, but it gives us the ability to do things that would be very difficult without that augmentation. So for research and development, it means that we can take better advantage of the massive amounts of data that we're able to collect and generate. We're able to learn faster and change the cycles of learning in a very impactful way. And in manufacturing and design, it used to be that you would conceive of a new technology, you would create a design, and then we would manufacture it to order, as it were. Today, the tools of manufacturing, particularly additive manufacturing and this nexus with AI, design optimization, means that the cycle is almost completely reversed. What you can make informs how you think about what you need. So it really is an extraordinary revolution that's happening at the same time. In bringing people into this enterprise, we've always sought to ensure that we have strong leadership in science and technology. And I believe foundationally that science and technology capability is part of our deterrent posture, demonstrating that we are strong and capable and have these intellectual capacities that allow us to be responsive. We have some of the most interesting, important, and impactful work that's going on in this sphere today, and that's very attractive to people who understand this and want to be a part of bringing stability to this very dynamic environment, and who see this challenge, see this changing science and technology environment and the implications it has, not just in the nuclear space, but for all threat reduction, chem, bio, rad, nuke, explosive. It truly is a transformational technology that will enable new types of threats, but so many opportunities for us to have smart strategies to counter them.
I want to come back to the question of testing in a few minutes, but maybe first, could you talk a little bit, Kim, to the question of space as a new horizon for nuclear weapons?
So space is interesting in two dimensions. If you would have told me 20 years ago that space would be entirely dominated by commercial ventures over the next 2 decades, I would not have believed it possible. But this is an interesting moment in time when these critical technologies that historically have been the purview of governments and nation states are now really in the hands of the private sector. So that's true for AI development, it's true for space launch. The revolution in commercial space launch has really been breathtaking and happened quite quickly. Similarly, the shift from space as a benign domain of exploration and communications to a domain of conflict has been fairly substantial in recent years and presents really interesting complications, particularly for a system that's highly dependent on secure communications. And so there's a push and pull here, trying to understand what nation states are doing in this space, what those who seek to have military capabilities in space might be doing, and trying to distinguish this in an environment where there are a very complex and large number of players and new people entering space all the time, new countries, new companies. So I think it's an interesting challenge.
Maybe it's worth taking a step back, John, and maybe you can talk a little bit about what is different from this current nuclear age from, for instance, the Cold War.
Well, I think in the Cold War, when it was understood that there were really two big nuclear powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, though there were in Europe two other centers of decision-taking in London and in Paris, there was an elaborate theory of nuclear deterrence and mutually assured destruction, which had the sort of engaging acronym of MAD, but nevertheless was actually quite sane in its execution. And there was a series of arms control activities that became part of a ritual of the diplomatic engagement with the Soviet Union. We had a SALT I treaty, we had a SALT II treaty, we had a START I treaty, we had a START II treaty. Organizations like my own, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, were doing their sort of angels on the edge of a pin calculations as to how one did nuclear accountancy, how did you create symmetry with asymmetry of capabilities. If you had multiple independent reentry vehicles, how do you count that against single ones? And
I think we all saw war
and there
games.
was all that sort of thing that was actually quite a constraining effort. Because so long as you were in an arms control negotiation, you were at least in discussions. It's true that arms control negotiations were sometimes more détente consuming than they were détente producing, because by definition it showed who was ahead and who might be behind, and that would create some temporary tensions. And then we had the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which was important because it engaged European public opinion a great deal, very exercised in the 1980s by the introduction of Pershing and cruise missiles into Europe in response to the then Soviet procurement of SS-20s. But there was still a residual sense that balance of power was not only possible, but was something that was being looked at. There is essentially no arms control negotiations at all happening now with anybody, and there are more actors and pretenders to nuclear thrones. There have been occasional attempts to engage China in an intermediate nuclear forces conversation, but that would mean them giving up Taiwan, because 95% of their short-range nuclear weapons are aimed at Taiwan, and were we to reduce that capacity, it would essentially be unilateral disarmament from a Chinese perspective. So the absence of any regulatory structure, to use a term from the economic and business environment, makes this quite frightening, and the addition of new actors, not all of them very healthy ones, is worrying.
Mr. President, at least part of the nuclear safety net has always required alliances and trust amongst those allies. Can you talk a little bit about, we have a new administration in the United States that has not been known in the past for wanting to foster those alliances. Can you talk a little bit about what you're anticipating from the new Trump administration in terms of its foreign policy in your region, but also as that relates to the nuclear weapons threat?
Well, I think that we still are waiting for all the top positions to be filled in the national security and foreign policy departments of the United States. So this administration is still taking kind of shape. But from our perspective, I would say that indeed there are a couple of points that we very much support what we are hearing about the need for Europe and also NATO allies at large to increase defense spending. I think that we all understand that American presence in Europe is indispensable, both conventional military presence, but also we are all, the whole NATO is under American nuclear umbrella, not only American, of course, as we know there is
some countries like Poland suggest that they need their own weapons.
Well, I think that this is at this point probably more rhetorical discussion, not a kind of serious policy change. We still have all the framework of non-proliferation that unfortunately we see is not as efficient as it probably was designed. We are talking about Iran, we are talking about some other countries that already have nuclear weapons. But basically I would say that I'm not as pessimistic as some of journalists or experts about the engagement of the United States in NATO or Europe, but we all understand that it's very much up to us, those countries that are part of alliance, to step up all the defense spending, to produce capabilities, but then at the end of the day, again, like it or not, even Europe taking much greater responsibility and role in defense of European continent or defense of alliance does not mean that we can live without the US being present. And that's, again, is something that we all talk about the strategic autonomy of the European Union or other things. We still need to engage with our very good friends and partners, the United States and the United Kingdom also.
Yeah. Thank you. Kim, there are concerns that the U.S. might resume underground explosive testing in the Trump era. Livermore just unveiled, as you mentioned, El Capitan, the world's fastest supercomputer, which helps to understand how nuclear weapons work so that testing isn't necessary. Can you describe what that research is and how you're undertaking it?
Sure. So for the last 30 years, the U.S. has been embarked on this science-based stockpile stewardship program. The goal there was to create a set of science and technology tools and ultimately modeling tools that would allow us to assure the safety, security, and reliability of the U.S. nuclear weapons stockpile without additional nuclear explosive testing. So that's been the premise all along. For about the first 20 years of that period, we were building capabilities. We identified a number of facilities and different types of infrastructure that we would need to achieve those goals, specific types of experiments. At my laboratory, that's the National Ignition Facility, where we study fusion and the most extreme states of matter in the universe, and our high-performance computing. As you said, we're number one with LCAP. And what we do is we take data, we build models, we incorporate those in large multi-physics simulations, and we use that to interrogate different attributes of nuclear weapons technology. And this system has been very successful. During the last decade, as we have learned, as our capabilities came online, as our ability to probe the relevant types of physics and chemistry and material science advanced, we have been able to assess and certify that the stockpile can be sustained without additional nuclear explosive testing from a technical perspective. Now, ultimately, the calculus on whether or not to resume nuclear testing is not simply a technical calculus, it's also a political calculus.
Of course.
The other thing we have in hand is the database from the U.S. nuclear testing program during the Cold War, which is very expansive. And so I think it's been a great contributor to stability that the U.S. was able to forego nuclear explosive testing. It certainly created a norm in an environment where we have seen many other norms degrade over time. And I feel, from a technical perspective, which is my role in this enterprise, that we have done extraordinary work, perhaps made more progress than we even anticipated in the beginning. The tools far outstrip the capabilities we imagined, that we can continue on this path. So what will happen? I don't know.
Yeah.
And as I said, there's a significant political calculus that remains to be adjudicated.
Yeah, of course, a nuclear weapon never needs to be used to actually be dangerous to humankind. We see in the aftermath of the testing during the Cold War, still today, the effects of it. John, maybe you can talk about whether or not you think we're going to see more nuclear nations before the end of this decade. Are there other countries that you think are going to pursue these weapons? We were talking earlier about Poland, but of course there's been conversations in South Korea and Japan on this topic.
Well, there's certainly an attraction for nuclear weapons when they see what the effect of just dangling the nuclear keys has had on North American and European public opinion about the risks on responding more firmly, perhaps, to Russia's engagement of Ukraine. And Putin just suggesting that he might have that in idea, possibly speaking Russian very slowly to Shoigu, so the NSA and GCHQ could pick him up, saying that, really should be an option. He did rhetorically another important move in November 2024 when he actually changed Russia's nuclear doctrine and appeared to lower the bar for when nuclear weapons might be used. I think I see this as a political move as much as a sort of deep, profound doctrinal one. It's another way of reminding people that he has this capacity. And people in the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific have noticed that the West has been restrained uniquely by the fear of potential Russian nuclear use in repelling Russia's invasion from Ukraine with the same severity and firmness of purpose as they repelled the only comparable invasion in the last 50 years, which was Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, which was exactly the same threat to the then Middle East security order as this was to the American one, to the European one. I like sometimes to say, when people from the Middle East talk about double standards, to say, well, actually, there is a double standard. When Iraq invaded Kuwait, we put all our forces in to eject Iraq from Kuwait to preserve the then Middle East security order. But when Russia invades Ukraine, we're a little bit more cautious. So perhaps we spend more time thinking about your order than ours, and that normally stops people in their tracks. But certainly, if you look at Iran, that have lost two of the three parts of its strategic triad. One, its ballistic missiles have shown not to be very able to penetrate much, and literally in some cases empty of warheads, and their proxies that were its main agent of disturbing on a day-to-day basis the balance of power in the Middle East have dissipated, so nuclear weapons become very attractive then to Iran. And I do think, as I said in my first answer to your first question, that if there is too much doubt about a US security guarantee, then Japan, Korea, others will look at that nuclear options again.
So in the opinion section of the New York Times over the past year, we've been exploring the modern nuclear threat through a series that we call At the Brink. My conclusion after more than a year of reporting on this topic and opining on it is that the most important thing we can do to make the world safer is to reignite arms control talks, making sure that nuclear nations are talking to each other on a regular basis. I'd love for each of you to go through one by one and tell us what you think needs to be done to make the world safer from nuclear weapons. Mr. President, do you want to start us?
Well, I think that indeed this kind of Cold War era practice of having arms control talks, and let's not forget that everyone was cheering up when President Reagan and President Gorbachev signed all the relevant agreements back in 1987 and then follow. But where we are today, actually, the whole architecture has been completely dismantled.
Right.
We don't have any, except a non-proliferation agreement, but I think we don't have any agreement left from that year.
Well, we have New START for one more year.
Yeah, but it's almost...
It's almost over, yeah.
Yeah, that's why I'm saying that
Yeah.
there is not. Are we ready to sit, I mean, as the kind of world community, are we ready to sit and negotiate and to get new arms treaties, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons? Frankly, I don't believe that currently there is any desire or momentum. Actually, seeing that there are countries like Ukraine that actually gave up its nuclear weapons back in 1994 up till beginning of 2000s, I think that currently it would be very difficult to convince publics in many countries and also decision makers that this kind of approach works. Ukraine is from time to time reminding us what happens if you give up voluntarily your nuclear power, and then all of a sudden you are invaded a couple of years later, and everyone who was guaranteeing your sovereignty and territorial integrity forgets about that. So I think that we still need some time before there is going to be any kind of movement. But with current, I would say, state of the world, I would say this is simply a kind of decade where most probably we will not be moving there.
There's also a lot less public attention to this issue today than there was at the end of the Cold War. We have 1 minute left, so Kim, John, if you wouldn't mind succinctly telling us what you think needs to happen next.
Sure. I'll just note that the laboratories have long provided technical support to arms control. We continue to do that. That's both developing new technologies, which will be essential to the new kinds of arms control that are needed in this multilateral environment, and directly supporting the teams that are making these negotiations, understanding the capabilities on both sides to make sure that there is a mutual benefit at the end of that process.
I think the only arms control negotiation that has a realistic chance of being started is one as between the United States, its EU partners, and Iran on an Iranian nuclear weapon. Despite what I said, the fact remains that the Iranian economy is in a shambles, and it's the only thing they can trade, and the Iranian people are much more able to express their public opinion than some people think. And the second broader thing is that many people deride Cold War thinking. But actually there was some good thinking during the Cold War, and we need to recover a little bit of the political military muscle memory of the Cold War. I'll leave you with one thought. How on earth can the United States and its European allies be at all credible in saying that they want to assure a free and open Indo-Pacific and that their tilt to Asia is realistic when North Korea tilts to Europe and we do nothing but confirm their presence in Europe? And when the Black Sea is closed, we don't open the Black Sea with force. who's going to think that we're going to keep the South China Sea free for the movement of commercial traffic? So I think restoring deterrence and a bit of our political military muscle memory would have a good impact on the security situation in the Middle East and Asia, the two areas from which most threats now emerge in the nuclear space.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's a great note to end on. And thank you again for being here.
Thank you.